It's actually quite groundbreaking what we're proposing to do here. It's been done at small scale, but we're going to exploit an opportunity that will allow us to really scale significant amounts of institutional capital in the UK to begin with, hopefully in time perhaps overseas, in a way that will help nature restoration.
Eoin, it's great to have you on the Rebalance Earth podcast. Thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and also about your journey in the world of finance and sustainability?
Sure, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me along. It feels like a real privilege. My journey, a little bit about myself. So, 57 years old, father and grandfather, and somebody who gets very excited about the mere mention of nature, let alone the opportunity to actually be in it. I've been a fund manager in one shape or another for 34 years. Feels like a long time. Started out life as a quant, so modeling equities and asset allocation through the application of econometric models. But over time, got kicked up the greasy pole. There were much better quants than I was ever going to be coming out of various grad schools, and found a niche, if you like, as a CIO for a couple of different organizations, including a little spell running my own firm, managing a whole array of strategies, which have sort of slowly taken me a journey through sustainable finance, and then in the latter sort of 5-6 years into nature strategies in particular.
Excellent. And by CIO, Chief Investment Officer, right?
Yes, exactly.
And you're also a volunteer and the search and rescue member of Exmoor. What role has that played in terms of your views of nature and perhaps finance too?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it has influenced me in a couple of very specific ways. So in a positive sense, I truly understand the value of being out in nature to my own personal well-being, and I can see the same thing reflected in others. So that for me is a really critical part of my own personal journey, and I'd love, part of my being involved with Exmoor's Mountain Rescue Team is to make that safe for other people to enjoy that same privilege. On the flip side, I'm also super conscious that I do get to see things which are maybe less pleasant. So as part of our flood rescue group, do get to see when homes, properties, businesses are severely damaged by flooding, and that is never a pleasant outcome for anybody. I think also, perhaps uniquely, there's an interesting relationship between search and rescue and investment, which has got something to do with risk management and how one approaches a difficult situation, the backup plans that one puts in place, and just more generally how you risk manage a situation. So actually, I think there are some really interesting parallels that come out of those two pieces of my life.
Indeed, and let's just dig into this a little bit more, because when we hear about flooding, there's a stat that 1 in 8 households in the UK gets flooded. So maybe some of our listeners would have experienced that, but you see it in quite an extreme situation. And sometimes that's not quite, I would say, grabbed by statistics, by numbers. So perhaps can you give a more like human version of the impacts? And have you seen in your time as a search and rescue member an increase in these kind of flood events? And perhaps have they changed also in character?
Yeah, massive increase. And I would say that from a sort of search and rescue perspective, we are waiting for the next major one. And I can say that as somebody who, unfortunately was in Cumbria and then York back in the mid-teens, involved in those efforts. And our role there can manifest in a number of different ways. So sometimes it might be pre-actual event evacuation, because we've got a very good idea that certain properties will be underwater. Or worse than that, it might be post-flood event, in which case we are either doing simple welfare checks on property owners, or we're helping people evacuate. And that can be very emotional for the individuals concerned. And yeah, quite difficult to see or to witness, if you like, the emotional reaction that individuals have to seeing their livelihoods their properties completely trashed by flooding.
And so we're seeing these kind of real human and financial costs that are related to flooding. And as you said, you get excited by nature. Nature seems to be the cause of these problems. Is it the cause or is it the solution? How would you look at it from this duality side?
So nature is definitely the solution. Humans are the cause.
Yes.
And I think again, there's a piece there around humans' attempt to sort of rule over nature hasn't necessarily gone terribly well, and we're experiencing that manifested in many different ways: climate change, biodiversity, ecosystem loss, and then, as we're talking about now, more directly flooding.
Mm.
So yeah, nature is a huge part of the solution here.
So wearing your CIO's hat, where do you see the role of investment and the potential for nature to address those challenges? Where does that intersection happen?
Yeah, so it would be very tempting just to answer that by looking at that direct intersection of nature investment, but I actually think it's much, much broader. And it almost doesn't matter what asset class you are looking at. Considerations of nature, of resource, of ecosystem properties are essential. So let me give you, the examples. We can be looking at listed equities, corporates, and they have supply chains. Many of those are reliant on various ecosystem services or different aspects of nature as resource. So just with a simple corporate equity strategy, we've got to be thinking about, well, how am I engaging with that corporate entity to improve its interactions with nature, its impacts, its dependencies, and what opportunities and risks exist for that corporate. At the same time, we can look at the bond market. And most people say, well, bonds and nature have nothing in common, but I would wholeheartedly disagree. Again, huge opportunities to better incorporate nature into the bond markets, either through sustainability-linked bonds with very specific nature KPIs, or in the re-emerging debt for nature swaps market. Now, neither of those are perfect in their current form and existence, but wow, they could be such powerful instruments if we can get them right. And then, of course, we go to the direct interactions with nature. And that might be from a property perspective, it might be from an agricultural perspective, food systems more generally, or specific ecosystem services. And I know we'll talk more about carbon, biodiversity, water, etc. But they are all part of that direct interaction between nature and investing.
So you talked about, an asset class, and I'd like to understand, in your views, what makes nature compelling asset class for investors, and how would that differ from traditional investment options? And we talked, you mentioned bonds, for example. So how does nature as an asset class differ itself from those traditional products?
I think nature is a super compelling asset class for a number of reasons. So we've got the financial return element associated with investing in nature. We know all about that. But then there's the co-benefits piece. There's the direct impacts that we can have, which manifest in other ways. And they can range from, everything from socioeconomic benefits around employment, improved livelihoods, include things like better healthcare results, right through to, physical food system improvements that we can do actually on the ground. So the range of benefits that come from nature as an asset class are huge.
And from your experience, what would you say are the potential financial returns and environmental benefits that can come out of investing in nature, investing in that nature class? And can you provide some illustrative examples of what are the returns and benefits that investors could be expecting out of that?
If I may, I will turn it around slightly and answer the question from the perspective of what should an investor be demanding from us as managers of natural capital? Well, let's start with the basics. We'll have a risk-free premium, a risk-free rate, I beg your pardon. We'll have a risk premium associated with the asset class. And then we have to be honest, this is not a liquid asset class. So there'll be an illiquidity risk premium associated with that. A rough guesstimate would put that around sort of the 10 to 12% marker. in terms of gross IRR, returns that an investor would look at. So that's one aspect, and a very raw one. Secondly, an investor would want to think about, well, what are the risks associated with investing in nature? And I actually think that we can put in place a whole range of different mechanisms that serve to de-risk the asset class. Even though it's nascent and quite new, we can actually do a lot to make an investor very comfortable that the risks really are quite low. And then the third important thing an investor will seek when they're looking at things in a portfolio context is, how does this diversify my existing portfolio relative to the results I'm looking for? And of course, an investment in nature is not vulnerable to components of the economic cycle, the same that many other investments in the portfolio will be. So it's really deliciously uncorrelated in that sense. So there are sort of three really powerful forces that an investor can tap into.
I just want to come back to that second one, because that risk, is that the main reason where we're not seeing, if I may use this pun, a flood of investors going into investing in nature? Is it really just because of that second point regarding the risk that is holding them back, or is there other factors at play, which is perhaps acting as a barrier to that flow of investors?
Yes, I think in some sense investors see this as a newer asset class, and that comes with an automatic amount of trepidation around, do I want to be a first mover or a second mover, early taker of that? But I would point to the fact that we've had investing in agriculture, investing in timber and forestry for decades. So investors shouldn't really, or they don't need to be worried that this is something altogether new. Now, yes, certain instruments might be new. Again, we'll talk more about carbon, biodiversity, and other forms of payment for ecosystem service, but they really are building on very solid foundations for a style of investing that's been out there for a long, long time.
Excellent. So let's look at what success looks like. So can you share an example of a successful nature-based investment that demonstrates the potential of this asset class by delivering economic, environmental, and social returns, please?
Sure. The classic one for me is it's a small project, but a really important one. And it was the Wyre catchment natural flood management, WYRE for those that want to Google that project. And this is a great example for me because we had about 1.7 million of blended finance, so both public and private finance, that was invested into the project. The project then delivered back in a couple of years' time just over £2 million in revenue, so a nice return over that period. And I suspect that was probably actually quite a conservative estimate of what was delivered. Plus that you then had a host of co-benefits that were delivered in terms of payment for ecosystem services by both government and corporate entities, as well as restoring a section of river to its natural state with all the ancillary benefits that come from that. So that for me is a perfect example and something I think that we at Rebalance Earth will look to do and look to copy, but just at bigger scale.
Excellent. And it's interesting because in this example, you didn't talk about carbon credits. You didn't talk about biodiversity credits or even biodiversity net gain units. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about those instruments and why in this successful example they weren't mentioned? Is there something about those credits and units which makes it perhaps more challenging for a success story? I'm curious to get your views on that.
No, I don't think it is in that sense challenging. And I actually think that biodiversity markets and carbon markets could have been part of that example if the developers had so wished. I think it's important to sort of separate out the carbon market as it is in the UK today from the biodiversity and nutrient markets. The former is a voluntary market, the latter are compliance markets, so they're compulsory. Now, everybody will have read the headlines in the Guardian newspaper around some of the challenges that the carbon markets have seen, but we should be very clear that that is particularly around avoidance projects, typically in the global south, where people are being paid not to do a certain thing to nature, usually chop down a forest, so not to chop down that forest. And those carbon offset programs have been more contentious. There have been debates around the selection of appropriate baselines and other technical matters. But by and large, I would still argue that the voluntary carbon market, for the most part, works well. Sure, it could be improved on. And similarly, early days for biodiversity net gain here in England. And again, I'm very conscious that there will be those that say that other things that can be done to get that even better. And hopefully those will all happen. So they can be part of the solution. I wouldn't want anybody to go away and think that's not the case. But the Wyre example, as you say, is this lovely, is a perfect example of being able to do things in nature without having to resort to either of those two markets that exist already today.
It's interesting because this project is a great example, but it's still relatively small. What do you think is the potential for these kind of projects to scale at a much larger level?
Let me answer your question in two ways from slightly different angles, if I may. The first point is around the nature financing gap that we face here in the UK, which the Green Finance Institute estimated that would be around about 60 odd billion a year through to 2030. So that's a huge sum, and we are nowhere near that today. I think the second way to look at this is from the investor angle, and to think about if I was an investor, an asset owner, allocating to different asset strategies, what might seem a reasonable allocation to an asset class like nature investing, given what we've said about the return opportunity, the risks involved, and the lack of correlation with other asset classes? I'm thinking that it might be 5 to 10%. Now, I know others have said 2% would be an amazing target, and I have huge sympathy for that too. That would be a great place to start, but I actually think it could be even bigger.
I'd like to work a little bit on that. As you know, we had Rob Gardner in our first episode, and he mentioned about the 2% for nature, where there is £5 trillion worth of assets in the pension industry in the UK. If we put 2% of that, that's 100 billion to address this gap we are seeing. I'd love to perhaps get your rationale or your optimism on what you think it could be more than 2%, and how could we get to that?
Yeah. So shortly after Rob came out with his 2%, which is sort of serves as my baseline target here, there was another survey done of asset owners by a different asset manager, and that suggested that the asset owners themselves were looking at 3 to 5%. The reason that I think that's probably still on the low side is that I don't think we really have fully thought through the potential scale of opportunities. And I say that because I think so much of our focus today is on terrestrial opportunities. We're only really starting just to look at the edges of marine opportunities, things that can be done in the near shore that will improve nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I think when you take all of that into account, actually, I think the opportunity is bigger still. So that's why I'm in that optimistic 5 to 10% bracket.
Amazing. And could you perhaps give some few examples of that marine opportunity? What does that look like? And what are some of the projects you may have seen across the UK that we could perhaps learn from?
Yeah. And again, I think this speaks to needing to have a really holistic view of what one is looking at. So what I mean by that is, let's say that we're looking at seagrass restoration opportunities around the coast of the UK. We all know that seagrass has been depleted some 92% from its peak previously. So huge benefits to restoring that. But those benefits are multiple. So seagrass operates in several different ways. Putting again to one side any carbon potential, we know that it serves as a nursery for young fish, which help to replenish stocks in that sense. We know that it has properties around coastal erosion and protection. So if we take into account all of these things, it's very easy to get super excited about some of those opportunities. And that's before we even start talking about kelp or seaweeds or crustaceans more generally. Just a significant range of opportunities in our near shore.
Excellent. Now, I want to come back to the investors themselves. Who do you think are the best type of investors to look at nature as an asset class? Are we looking at pension industry, or are we looking at perhaps insurance? Who do you think are some of the best investors, the most suitable for investing in nature?
Yeah. I actually think that it's an asset class that will appeal to almost all categories of investor, asset owner, if you prefer. I think potentially the odd one out will be defined benefit corporate schemes, many of which are cash negative and in runoff or fully liability matched at this stage. And so they won't necessarily wish to have sort of long duration commitments, such as investing in nature, on their books. That makes complete sense. But almost every other class of investor, I suspect, is thinking, this is a real opportunity for us. So that could be anything from the local authority pension funds, their amalgamated pools, through to defined contribution and master trust investments for us as personal pension holders, endowments, foundations, of course. And then we get to insurance companies, where it would be really great if we had a little bit of policy cleanup, as it were, around some of the capital adequacy rules and how insurance companies can treat investments in nature on their balance sheet. So huge opportunity right across the piece, really.
And just to be 100% clear, we're talking about these are investments made from a financial perspective, not from a regulatory. So they're not being forced to make those investments. They don't have to hold it in their books. It's literally, I'm assessing this asset class from a pure financial perspective that will give me healthy returns.
Absolutely. This is an attractive investment across the three dimensions that we mentioned from a financial perspective. Plus, then we've sort of begun to unpick a little bit on the impact side as well.
You're currently working at the Crowther Labs. And can you explain what your role entails and the purpose of the seed index, please?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. In my 12-month sabbatical, I am really lucky to be working with Professor Tom Crowther and his team. Tom, of course, is best known for leading the groundbreaking work on showing that the Earth was, the planet was home to around about 3 trillion trees, with space for about 1 trillion more just on degraded land.
Wow.
So that was a very powerful statement, which Tom then came out and refined by saying, but of course, that's not the only answer, which leads us to the work that you and I will embark on together next year. So the seed index is all about seeking to get a truly holistic, globally standard measure of the state of nature for any terrestrial and ultimately any marine location on the planet. And that's critical because we need to have a starting point. We want capital to deploy to nature strategies, but if we don't know where our starting point is, how will we measure whether we've made improvement or not? SEED, in short, it captures the 9 critical axes that ecologists will tell you, and I am not an ecologist, are vital to measuring nature. And so they are, respectively, the genetic variation of animals, plants, and microbes, the species variation of animals, plants, and microbes, and then ecosystem variation according to condition, function, and structure. So if you can measure those 9, which is what SEED does, amalgamate those together into a single index, then you have a unique, true measure of nature.
Amazing, amazing. And how does that work at seed index relate to some of your previous experiences you had, for example, at Federated Hermes, and particularly in building an impacts database?
Yeah, so I think my last few years at Federated Hermes were very much concentrated on driving investment into nature across sort of several different strategies and listed corporate equities, looking at the fixed income opportunities, and then a real asset nature-based strategy on the ground. And it struck me that without having a true measure of the state of nature that everybody could get behind, instead of having to resort to multiple measures to pick up all the different components, we wouldn't really see capital to start to flow properly into nature. So when I knew that I had a sabbatical ahead, super excited to offer my services to Tom Crowther and the lab to help them bring seed to market, which we will do in a couple of weeks' time at COP16 in Colombia.
Amazing, amazing. Perhaps coming back to the Wyre example, or maybe using it as a case study, I really want to focus on this element of how do you drive greater investment in nature. But here, I'd love for your answer to comment on what is the role that government, private, and financial can play in driving greater investments in nature. And if there are any examples or strategies each sector can employ to facilitate this, I'd love to get your insights on that.
So this is one. This is a topic that I've thought about quite a lot, and my approach to this is to look at it from a systems perspective. So I would see, government, corporates, financial institutions as all being actors on the same stage, and every single one of them has a role to play. So let's start with sort of governments and state entities. Well, they're clearly involved in defining policy and in setting a regulatory framework that is supportive of the investments in nature that need to happen. They might also achieve that through subsidies. If you think about the size of potentially harmful environmental subsidies that still exist today, something like 2.4 trillion a year. I mean, it's a ginormous sum. So maybe just starting by removing those would be an amazing first step for that government state actor on the stage. Then we look at corporates, and we know that corporates rely on resources. Those resources many times come from nature, and they're embedded right throughout those supply chains. So corporates, not just driven by regulation, but it's in their own best interests to do a lot of work around how do I secure a supply of those resources in the future, right throughout the supply chain, because it's to their own bottom line benefit, if for no other reason. And then we as investors can think about, well, what is the role that we can play here in driving capital, regardless of the asset class, indirectly through the equity and bond markets, or more directly through real asset projects on the ground, again, to bring back nature, to stop biodiversity and ecosystem loss, because they are critical to the survival of our planet.
Absolutely. And perhaps on a more, positive note, I'd say, so if I had a magic wand, what changes would you make to our current financial system to better value and protect nature? Really would love to get your insights on that.
I think there are two things that we should be doing. And one is to think about, so we work within an existing financial and economic system, and we've got to think about how we make that better. Because as much as our second option, which is conceiving of a new financial and economic system, my sense is that whilst we should also put some energy into that, if we only focus on that latter, it's going to take too long. So this is a two-pronged assault. Let's do what we can within the existing system, and then also let's give room for thought towards that bigger picture piece around, is there a better way in which we can organize our lives that will get a longer lasting result that makes sure we never get back into this mess again?
Now, you're familiar with the Rebalance Earth proposition.
I might be.
You might be. And I'm delighted that, you will be joining our team in the near future. But in terms of your reflection and considering, our proposition, what was it about our proposition that excited you and why?
The Rebalance Earth proposition I find really exciting because it's actually quite groundbreaking, what we're proposing to do here. It's been done at small scale, but we're going to exploit an opportunity that will allow us to really scale significant amounts of institutional capital in the UK to begin with, hopefully in time, perhaps overseas, in a way that will help nature restoration. So we're going to do it with an emphasis that hasn't really been done before. And you talked a little bit about this earlier. We are not going to rely first and foremost on carbon and biodiversity markets, but looking more broadly at other payment for ecosystem services and nature as a service contracts specifically related to water, natural flood management, water quality improvement, and drought mitigation. So lots of stuff for us to be getting our teeth into.
That we do. And for our listeners who are intrigued by this concept, and what are some practical steps they can take to learn more or get involved in nature-based investing? Because I failed to mention at the beginning, because you also completed a sustainable agriculture postgrad at St. Andrews. I mean,
Sustainable
except from
aquaculture.
Sorry?
Sustainable aquaculture.
Yes. Sustainable agriculture. Postgrad at St. Andrews. I mean, what would you advise listeners to do if they want to get more involved in nature investing?
So I think there's several things they can do. There are so many wonderful books out there. And if anybody would like recommendations, I'd be happy to lend some books because we're in a circular economy that will help. And that for me is about self-education. And I went on my own journey with that. And that's why I did the Masters in Sustainable Aquaculture. Federated Hermes, we've done a lot of work that taught me stuff about terrestrial nature restoration, but marine was just a big gap for me. And I thought, I have no business deploying people's capital to this stuff unless I actually know what I'm talking about. So that was a real motivation for me. And the education piece, I think, is critical to this. But I would encourage everybody out there, all the listeners, most will have pension funds. Go to your pension fund provider and ask them what they're doing about nature. Ask them to tell you about the existing portfolio holdings exposure to nature. And you might be slightly shocked at what you find. If that is the case, and I'm right, then ask them to make some changes. That would be my biggest wish for anybody listening.
Many businesses are still hesitant to invest in nature. What would you say to skeptics who aren't convinced about the business case for natural capital?
Sure. So the first thing I say to skeptics is don't listen to me. I'm a practitioner and thoroughly biased. Instead, I can point them to a recent meta-study that looked at thousands of different research papers, which showed that nature-based solutions are 71% cost-effective. Take that statistic away. 28% more are cost-effective under certain constraints. That's over 90. So we're in really positive business territory.
So my final question is, who are the two guests you'd love to hear discuss nature capital on this podcast and why?
Okay, I'm going to answer that as two different podcasts that you'll have.
Okay.
And one is going to be a joint guest. Basically, I'm cheating because I'm giving 3.
Will you join in the interviewing them?
I'd love to. Yes.
Okay.
So the first pairing would be a pair of academics who I think are doing leading work on that nexus of nature and investment in the UK. They're both at Oxford. So one is Dr. Nicola Ranger. She's done some amazing work with the Green Finance Institute and others on looking at nature-related risks for the UK. That's where our 12% loss of income figure by 2050 came from. The other is Dr. Sophus Zuermgassen. Sophus has been doing some amazing work on the policy side. And that's stuff that we already see some of the results of. And I know that he's seeking improvement, but he's also then involved in land use strategy, which of course for the UK is a critical area that we need to focus on. So that's my academic podcast. And the second individual I would have from the practitioner world is Benedict MacDonald, founder of Restore, acclaimed author. If you haven't read his work, some of his work on cornerstone species, thoroughly recommend it. But also, he has his boots on the ground and is producing amazing results in various rewilding nature restoration projects around the UK.
Amazing, Eoin. Well, listen, I'd love to have you back on the show as a co-host, and we can have that conversation with each of your guests. It's been a real pleasure having you on Rebalance Earth podcast, and I'll be seeing you very shortly, I'm sure.
Thank you. Yes, in a few months' time.
Indeed. Thank you, Eoin.
My pleasure.